Good afternoon, my friends. My name is Ming. I'm the Jolly Good Fellow of Google, and I'm also the head of the School of Personal Growth in Google University. And I'm delighted today to welcome our friend, Dr. Daniel Goleman, back to Google. Dr. Goleman, as you know, is an internationally known psychologist, an award-winning science journalist, and a best-selling author. His 1995 book, Emotional Intelligence, spent more than 1.5 years on the New York Times bestsellers list. His other popular books include Social Intelligence, Working with Emotional Intelligence, and Destructive Emotions. Dan has received many awards for his writing, including a Career Achievement Award from the American Psychological Association, and he was elected the Fellow of the American Association for Advancement of Science, but sadly, he was not elected a Jolly Good Fellow. Dan played a key role in helping Google University create our emotional intelligence curriculum that we now know as SIY, Search Inside Yourself. When Dan visited Google in 2007, we told him of our plans to develop such a program, and he very generously gave us the gift of his time and wisdom, and he became our advisor on the project. And SIY has been a very successful curriculum ever since, and we couldn't have done it without you. Thank you. Dan Goleman will always be a friend to Google University, so he's like a friend emeritus to us. And in real life, I found Dan to be both highly intelligent and deeply compassionate. And I'm very proud to have a friend like him. And my friends, let's welcome Daniel Goleman. Thank you.
Thank you, Ming. I'm really happy to be back here. Last time, when Ming had me come and talk about emotional intelligence, it ended up evolving into the SIY course. And I don't know what's going to happen after today. I hope something happens here. But I've got to give you a heads up. Today, when I talked about emotional intelligence, it's pretty upbeat. Today it's going to be some bad news and then some worse news. And then it'll be some good news and better news, so just bear with me. Because I want to talk about being intelligent about our ecological impacts and how I believe information systems can essentially save us from ourselves if we do it well, if we do it right, and if we do it soon. I'm going to introduce you to two of my personal heroes, Dara, who's going to share the podium, and Gregory, Norris, both of whom are working on the kinds of systems I see as exactly what we need. They're building open source, open platform, ecological transparency information systems, which I think is pretty relevant to what's going on here. And I also want to share with you news of a new science which can provide some information that desperately needs to be organized and free. This is a CD set I just received, hot off the press. That's an antiquated phrase. Do you know what that means, hot off the press? There used to be presses. It's a long story. Anyway, so this is an in-depth conversation with Greg and Dara and some other folks. But what I like about it is it has this little insert, which is the life cycle of this CD set, and our topic today really hinges on life cycles of the stuff we get, use, buy, throw away. This talks about there were trees involved in water and aluminum mines and polycarbonate plastic and lacquer and dyes, and there was a paper mill and CD manufacturing and so on. But what I like is at the end it says, the rest of this CD's set's life is up to you. After listening to Ecological Awareness, that's the set, for 100 years, the estimated viability of the CDs themselves, you can either throw it away or recycle it in a landfill. The packaging will biodegrade in a few months. Aluminum may take 200 years, and the plastic perhaps 450 years. While it decomposes, the plastic will leach BPA, an essential ingredient of polycarbonate and a known endocrine disruptor. Yet, happily, the paper is 100% recyclable, and the CDs are too. This is the kind of full disclosure, a little tongue-in-cheek, admittedly, but the kind of full disclosure that I think we need to head for in thinking about everything that we have in our houses, everything we buy every day. Let me ask you this. How many folks here routinely recycle? I don't mean here, but when you're at home. Oh, well, I should have known this is Google, so. Print on both sides of the paper? Anybody? Oh, it's really good. What else do you do that helps the environment? Compost? That's it? Okay. You take the shuttle bus, yeah? Use fewer napkins. That's great. Someone else? You're vegetarian. That's good in terms of ecological footprint. Yeah.
Rags instead of paper towels.
Yeah. That's all to the good. All of that helps. But here comes the bad news. Oh, no, actually, it's kind of the good news disguised in the bad news. It doesn't help as much as we need to. The next step is not just what we can do, you and me. That's been the focus of so much of the environmental movement. It's looking at what we buy and making better and smarter decisions about what we get. Why do I say that? Well, Gregory Norris is an industrial ecologist. It's a new discipline. And their methodology, main methodology, is called life cycle assessment. And this is a group of people who are quants, who are engineers, who are biologists, who are chemists, industrial designers. What they do is look at a product through the entire life cycle and get metrics for impacts on the whole range of environmental impacts, health impacts, social impacts. So Greg was asked by Stonyfield yogurt. Anybody eat Stonyfield yogurt? Yeah. I have nothing to do with them, but I like it too. This is not a sponsored plug. Stonyfield yogurt asked Greg, well, look at our environmental impacts. And so he did, and he found that when you recycle those packages that the yogurt comes in, we all do that, right? Yeah. That helps with 5% of the environmental impact of that product. The rest of the impact is in manufacturing and transport. So in other words, we have been focusing on lots of energy on a very narrow span of the total impacts of the stuff that we buy. And the next step is to look at them in this more sophisticated way so we can make better decisions. Greg also did an LCA, this is interesting, of the Netherlands power grid. Turns out that if you use a unit called the disability adjusted life year, this is the kind of thinking they do in this field, there is some negative impacts because of respiratory disease from emissions in the power grid to the people, the Dutch people. But if you look at the 10% of the supply chain for that power grid, where people in the poorest parts of the world have factories located, so they have work, and you look at the benefits from better nutrition, better education, better health, the benefits far outweigh the negatives. So this is a new kind of math. Are you dealing with that noise over there? I don't think it really interferes with, you can hear? Oh, with the recording. Well, the recording is everything. So just to give you another example of that math, I am now a devout carrier of a stainless steel bottle for water. I am now up to 20 bottles, throwaway bottles, plastic bottles, that this has replaced, okay? I don't know if you saw it. Greg and I also wrote an op-ed in the New York Times a couple Sundays ago comparing the life cycle assessment of stainless steel to plastic. First thing off the bat, I have to tell you, this may be a little bit of a shocker. If you just comparing one stainless to one plastic, the plastic is better. I said that last night in Marin and people gasped. But I guess stainless has a bad rap up there. But the reason is that to make stainless steel, you need chromium, you need nickel, you need to heat it all at a very high temperature for a very long time. Has very bad impacts. Chrome in mines, it's mined in places like Kazakhstan and South Africa where workers are not perhaps well protected from a substance which can be a carcinogen. So in other words, you've got to replace a lot of bottles, plastic bottles, to make this pay. But the math is there, and this is the amazing thing. This is what I want to share with you. There are hard numbers in this science. So when you get to 5 bottles replaced, you start to tip toward the stainless. Like there, I think it's fossil fuel depletion. I'm up around 20. I'm getting to the range where all the environmental impacts now favor this over the plastic. When I get to 500, that's the magic number. At 500, every impact, and the last 2 to go are ecotoxicity in water and metal depletion. Now, metal depletion is kind of puzzling for a plastic bottle, right? Where is the metal in the plastic bottle? Nowhere. Not in the bottle, it's in the supply chain. This math factors in the entire supply chain for every object. So in other words, we give each object total responsibility for its whole range of impacts over its whole lifespan, and that gives us a whole new way to look at things. For one thing, the first lesson here is green is a complete mirage. That is what's sold to us as green. If you realize that any object has 1,000 different impacts, and you take one thing and you clean it up and you call it green, hey, what about the other 999? I was here, in fact, this was last time I came to Google. I went to the local Nordstrom's in Palo Alto in the shopping center there. And there on the wall they had an organic t-shirt. And I thought, I'm going to help the planet. I'm going to buy that organic t-shirt. So I bought it. Then I started studying about LCAs, and I got more and more depressed about that t-shirt. I'll tell you why. Well, for one thing, it's harder to weave organic cotton. The strands are not as long, so you have to grow more cotton to get the same t-shirt. Cotton is an extremely thirsty product. It takes about 2,500 liters of water to grow the cotton in that t-shirt. And it's usually grown in water-scarce regions. The ROC has become a pond because of cotton plantations in that area. That shirt is dyed a gorgeous blue, but I'm sorry, textile dyes tend to be carcinogenic. It's been known in public health for decades that people who work in dye houses have higher rates of leukemia. So we have a long way to go. Instead of thinking of something as green, we should think about greening. We don't need it as an adjective, we need it as a verb, and that's what these information systems are going to help us do. I think we're entering an age of radical transparency where we can know, and this is the big revolution. Dara here has designed a system, information system called GoodGuide.com. It aggregates about 200 databases that give you the backstory, the hidden impacts of the things you buy, and it rates them in a 10-point scale, and it instantly compares other products. I was at a friend's house in the Bay Area the other night, and I was telling them about this, and they had a 14-year-old who immediately put on the Family Entertainment Center screen GoodGuide, and we started to play this neat game where you look on GoodGuide, which tells you, is it a 10, which is great? Is it a 5, which is not so great? Is it a 2, which is a disaster? You start to say, well, look up my deodorant, look up my shampoo. And all of a sudden, your eyes are opened. I found that the deodorant, which I will not name, which I've been using for decades, is a disaster. And then I found one that was better. In fact, at the end of this session, we all piled in the car and went to the local Walgreens and bought the better stuff. But this is what needs to happen at a massive scale, because this will bring us to a new era. If we get these information prosthetics, we can break through the defect built into the human neural system for danger. Our brain was designed in evolution to spot a particular range of stimuli, snarling animals, disgusting smelling foods, something that would help us survive in evolution. We have no sensors for the dangers we face today. They're too subtle. Some of this is so a little upsetting, really. I found, for example, that there's a chemical which is a carcinogen, which is used as a softener in plastics. It's in both IV bags and water wings. It enters moist skin most readily. There's a chemical in sunscreen which can become a carcinogen when exposed to the sun. There's a chemical another chemical in sunscreen that, I don't know, anybody like to snorkel here? I'm a big snorkeler, like to see reefs. Well, it washes off us while we're snorkeling, and it feeds a virus that kills the coral. So we don't know we're doing this. We have no idea. It's too subtle. It's like global warming. In a way, we have no direct perception that our human activity is heating the earth. It's at too great a scale for us to sense directly. So what we need is some kind of prosthetic device for information that will alert us, and that's what GoodGuide is. And I actually think GoodGuide opens the door to a kind of ecological intelligence. And what I mean by ecological intelligence is recapturing abilities that were always part of the human capacity until the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. If you look at a traditional culture like Tibet or Inuits in the Arctic or Bedouins in the desert, their style of life is exquisitely adapted to the ecosystem they inhabit. I was talking to someone who grew up as a nomad in Tibet. He said, we never had waste. There was no such, not even a word for it, because everything was reused. Everything either reused or was completely biodegradable. Once the Industrial Revolution started, we developed enormously beneficial manufacturing platforms and this palette of industrial chemicals without regard or any knowledge of what their actual ecological impact was to our health, to the planet, to the people that made it. Now we have a system for getting that, yielding that information, and we need to reevaluate the entire industrial and commercial enterprise in terms of its impacts and start a process that will continually upgrade it so we improve it. And it takes three things from each of us. One, when you shop, know what the impacts are of what you buy. You can know that now through GoodGuide. Second, favor improvements. And third, share what you know. And I think this is another way Google can help, because I can imagine a kind of YouTube ecological transparency shopping channel called This Sucks, something like that, or Stop Buying That, or This Is Better. Someone asked, I was talking about GoodGuide the other day, and someone says, why isn't it called Bad Guide? Because, the bottom 10 percentile is pretty bad. So if we can move in that direction, I think we can shift markets. We can move markets so that we create a virtuous cycle where companies start to pay serious attention to their ecological impacts, and that becomes an intrinsic part of the value of a product. And ideally, we will have reached the virtuous cycle when products have to compete for shelf space at Walmart on the basis of their ecological impact. Because that also will ripple through the supply chain and mean that manufacturers will be actively looking for innovations. By the way, this is a huge entrepreneurial opportunity. We have to reinvent everything, pretty much. If you start evaluating ecological impacts, we need new industrial platforms, new industrial designs. We need biomimicry as a basis for our chemistry and so on. So there's huge opportunity, but we have to get there first, and that's where Dara and Greg come in. So I've invited them to share with you the information systems. Dara, why don't you take the floor?
Thanks very much, Dan. As I was listening to your incredibly gracious and humbling comments, I had two thoughts. When I hear such an authoritative source, a fantastic science writer, pointing at our little project that is attempting to advance radical transparency in this current experiment, it makes me think, I hope to God that Google has figured out how to index the spoken word, and that an authoritative source pointing to us will up our page rank after today. So if you haven't figured that out, you should be working on it. We basically have been working for the last decade. I was a professor at MIT and taught with Greg there, and I'm a professor at UC Berkeley now, and doing work on two big problems that relate to Dan's book and the trends that he is spotting, which is how to present much better information to the public about the environmental, social, and health performance of the products and companies they're interacting with every day. And it's basically an information organization problem, a scientific assessment problem, and then an information distribution problem. So helping people find this information. There's a search component to it. And what we've done is take two types of science. The science of life cycle assessment to understand what matters scientifically if you assess a bottle or a t-shirt or a bottle of sunscreen or whatever. And the second thing is to understand what matters to consumers, what resonates with them, what actually is significant and is authoritative and what will matter. And merging those two sciences, we're trying to get better and better information to the public at the moment they're making a decision about a product or a company. So we have a beta site, GoodGuide.com, which is a real beta. This is not a Gmail kind of beta. This is real live beta that allows you literally in 1 or 2 clicks to get to something like, so Dan talked about sunscreens. We can get in 2 clicks to a top-rated sunscreen. And for most consumers, they want what we give a quick look, a health score, an environment score, and a social score. Literally in the 25 seconds or less that a consumer takes to make a decision in a store, we want to get them the information they need. If you want more information, you can then drill down into several hundred criteria of performance related to this product. We rate products across whether there are carcinogens, mutagens, reproductive health hazards, a full health hazard screen. We use environmental life cycle assessment, 2 techniques to evaluate the full environmental performance of the product and supply chain. It's carbon disclosure, EPA fines and violations, toxics released from the factory that produced it, as well as the social performance. Did they test on animals? How do they treat their workers? Do they have women in senior management position? Basically anything you would want to know about the company or the product and the supply chain behind that product. What we're trying to do is help people very quickly find products, not that match my values, but that match their own values, to help them find the things that matter to them. For if you look up a deodorant and it's a bad product, so obviously we have search and browse. So let's look up, I have a 6-year-old daughter, so I'll look up one of her favorite products, a strawberry milk. And let's take organic strawberry milk and find out how it does in the system. We see very quickly there are some good things and some not so good things about this organic strawberry milk. It turns out we take things like the nutrition facts, which is available information but largely incomprehensible to the U.S. public. They can't make heads or tails of the current public disclosure. We try to turn it into something meaningful and identify, in this case, sugar is a problem. This 8 ounces of strawberry milk has more sugar than a can of Coke. Most people wouldn't know that. We'll go into artificial colors, many of which are now banned in Europe because of association with ADHD. There are many things in our store shelves, like the oxybenzone, the sunscreen Dan alluded to, bisphenol A in your Nalgene bottle, which many of us were walking around with Nalgene bottles 2 years ago. They're out the door. We're understanding more and more what are in these products, where they come from, how they're made. And with every product scandal we see, every recall, every major problem we're seeing in the market, we have more and more of the public wanting to know this information. So as I said, we're very early in this process of trying to help people discover the full information behind these products, to discover better products, to immediately send messages to companies if you want to contact the company and tell Horizon, you know, love your milk, but really wish you would solve this problem or change this. You can do that instantly. Share it with your friends, post it to your Facebook, begin to compare yourself with other people and their performance. We, of course, have an iPhone app, which is a free iPhone app, which is doing very well. To get this information out into stores, we're going to build an Android app. We've got the barcode scanning working, so it'll be on Android soon. We're basically trying to get this out whenever you are making a decision about a product or a company. We want to get you the best information in the world. And that's something, again, to Dan's point, there's some very exciting opportunities now. We're opening our API over the next month to get this information out in the world, potentially out in places like Google Product Search or out in Google Org when it's talking about health or climate or other places. Get it out to nonprofits, to academics, to expose this data in ways it's never been exposed, to allow people to do new things with it. We're focused right now on getting this to consumers and helping them make better decisions, empowering them to vote with their dollars and to really make demands in the marketplace, to advance this radical transparency in a way that it really hasn't been available before. We're at the very first, really the tip of the iceberg on this, and we're looking to more and more experts like Greg who are advancing the hard science of life cycle assessment behind our data, and I'll hand it over to him to let him talk about some of his work that feeds into our work that then can feed out to the public.
Thanks to Dara and especially to Dan for inviting me here, and to Meng for inviting Dan, so Dan could invite me.
But who invited me?
And I really have to thank Dara for telling Dan about the work that I was doing in the first place. And this is not a subject of my talk, but I someday I do want to see an app where we can basically give credit and see these incredible webs of credit. Everything that happens, has so many strings of causation. And we'd also, maybe someday we could go in and find out, wow, we did some good things out there. So you could give thanks. But that's completely off the topic. What I'm supposed to do is really give you a taste of life cycle assessment. What is it? How have we been doing it? The quick story is the hard way. And how are we about to start doing it, which is going to be, I think, a radically transformative way. And so that's it. I just want to cover those issues really quickly with you. But I think there's some ideas in here, hopefully, that will be exciting and resonant with some of your own, possibly some of your own work. Life cycle assessment, as Dan says, we use it to study these long supply chains. Basically, every supply chain is global. In fact, I did a little analysis once that I found every supply chain in the United States includes every sector. So if you buy a product from one sector in this economy, you stimulate at least a tiny amount of output from each sector in the U.S. economy. And also there's, of course, trade stimulated throughout the global economy. In life cycle assessment, we take each step in the supply chain and we model it, measuring these 4 different types of flows. So maybe we'll start with the product outputs going to the right and all the purchased inputs coming from the left. Some processes extract from nature, so those are the flows coming up from the bottom, and many processes emit to nature, to air, water, or soil. We track each of those flows for each of these unit processes, and then we build databases with chains of typically over 1,000. On the database I often use now has between 1,000 to 3,000 unit processes in each chain. So here we're looking at a laptop computer, and we're just looking at some of the most important inputs. In fact, when you get this graph, you get a little warning that says we're only looking at 13 of the 1,500 and some unit processes in the supply chain for a laptop computer. Now, we study that whole chain, but we do it, one of the main outputs is to get what you could really call an environmental footprint. We know what carbon footprints are now these days. It's the total carbon burden getting to some point. Water footprints is all the water consumed to get the product to you. So the environmental footprint is just a holistic portrait of carbon plus water plus toxics and so on, energy consumption. It starts as what we call a life cycle inventory, which is a table of data, usually on the order of 500 to 1,000 different flows, maybe 100 coming from nature, somewhere out there in that vast global supply chain, and about 900 going back to nature throughout that supply chain. That's too much data. That's something that really decision makers can't use. Just think of the 20 greenhouse gases. We need to boil down those greenhouse gases into a total carbon equivalent of global warming potential, and we do the same thing. We use this focusing lens that we call life cycle impact assessment. We've taken the supply chain with its 1,000 processes. We've boiled that down into a vector of 1,000 flows to or from the environment, and then we use the focusing lens of life cycle impact assessment to get to maybe a dozen impact categories. And we hand that off to Dara, and he translates that into a red or a green dot for your product. So how did we, the little word now is supposed to be way on the right-hand side, but that's what happens when you switch software. The way we've been doing LCA, as I said at the outset, is the hard way so far. Basically, consultants and researchers have gone out to facilities and said, give us your data. The facilities that are asked for this data often don't understand why it's being asked for. They just fill out the forms. Finally, it's one of those tasks that always makes it second place on your inbox if you're lucky. Finally, you do it and you send the consultant away, and your life is back to maybe as good as hers is there. But there's no rationale. It's the people with the data are not in the driver's seat. That's one of the things we're changing with Earthster and the systems I'll talk about. It's now the usage itself that drives the data collection, and publishing or authoring is an optional step. It's basically Web 2.0. We're saying put the ability to report this information in the hands of everyone. The inspiration for doing this came actually when I was studying social impact assessment, social impacts in life cycles back in 2003, 2004. I did a top-down analysis using the sort of big databases, and as Dan said, I found that the economic development benefits for health could exceed by a factor of 1,000 the health consequences of the pollution. And I was really excited. But then I started reading all the details of how economic development can go wrong and the importance of local participation in the design of the development and in the evaluation of the development. And I realized that factor of 1,000 is potentially good news, but it's potentially catastrophic news. You do it wrong and you probably have a factor of 1,000 worse. So somehow we got to get reporting capability to be ubiquitous, and yet we still want to aggregate all this at the end of the day. Ubiquitous reporting followed by aggregation and assessment. And that led to the creation of the Earthster platform concept. After we designed it, we said, wow, this would really be powerful for looking at the environmental flows that we deal with in LCA. So how does it work? We're really in alpha stage here, not beta, on Earthster, but it is being tested by the companies which have sponsored this nonprofit open source project to this point. The first thing it does, and I've touched on this so far, is it's ubiquitous empowerment. It puts life cycle calculation ability in the hands of anyone with web access. You go in and you basically define your unit process there using these same 4 types of flow that I showed in the diagram. What did I purchase? What did I emit? Did I extract anything from nature? And what's my product output? We use that confidential information on our own computer to calculate a result. With the result, we can do things right away. We can figure out which of my inputs matter most environmentally. Where's most of my carbon footprint coming from? What about my toxic burden? So I can prioritize my inputs for improvement. I can do what-if analysis. If I shift my manufacturing processes or if I change suppliers, how do my impacts get better? So those steps I can do right away. Step 2, I have the option to publish for free in the web. What do I publish? I'm not publishing, of course, my production function. I'm not publishing the quantities of inputs that I use. That's confidential information for most companies. But that's okay, because what most people downstream want to hear is the footprint of my product. Right? So I just publish that vector, that total cradle to gate, we call it. Think of it as a bottom line. Just like the costs of production are confidential, but the price of my product is public knowledge. Here I'm going to publish essentially the ecological price, you could say, of my product. The reason that's exciting is if I can do it and if everyone can do it, then my suppliers can do it too. And if my suppliers can do it, I can link to their data rather than generic average data. So we can get started by using generic average data, which is what we've got in our databases now, but then we can organically degenericize these supply chain models by me picking up the phone and saying, my biggest impact is the plastic I buy from you. Would you please use Earthster and publish your data? And if it's better than average, I'm going to link to that. And then 2 weeks later, I come in and I find out that my product is greener still because my supplier has gotten their supply chain talking through this system. I think you can see how this has the potential to stimulate a lot of positive feedback loops. First of all, there's the network effects of making it more visible. The more visible it becomes, the more consumers are asking for this information. The GoodGuide is definitely a massive stimulus for accelerating the development of this information. But there's also another important feedback loop, and that is the more people develop product-specific data and publish product-specific footprints, the more they've gathered the on-site data necessary, which could then be aggregated to create new averages in the database. So think of Earthster as feeding on industry average data, and then sort of maybe composting is the right term, is putting more and more nutrients back into that soil and enriching the databases. We don't have this thing live yet, and we've already got the interesting situation that two of the larger companies on the planet have essentially said this is a literal quote during a lunchtime break one time. We want to say to you, thanks, Greg, we'll take it from here. But as we do so, do you have any thoughts, any last words? Things that in particular you think the system has to, properties of the system that it needs to have. This Earthster is an open source project. I've presented these ideas for the last 5 years. There are no secrets. We've described this concept. We've been trying to get people to understand it, as we've been also raising some funds to get it built. My answer is yes, I do have a few words, a few final words. And if I could only say one, and I could say it 100 times, that would be the word. What do I mean by open? There are two sides to openness. Well, there are many sides, of course, but I'd like to distinguish two that are important. On the one hand, and absolutely essentially, the data has to be open. In fact, the data has to be transparent and universally web accessible. We don't have time today to talk about all the reasons why that is, but chances are you understand it. If I use the word generativity, a lot of you know what I'm talking about. It also needs to be extensible. The things we track now in life cycle assessment are more than what we used to track and less than what we're going to be tracking in the future. So we've got to be able, as community of users globally, to extend that format. It also needs to be modular, so that people can continue to innovate the applications here. In closing, I would say that I really feel from looking out at the trends, including the GoodGuide, including many of the things that Dan talks about in his book, that there's a sort of underlying urge on the part of the economy to know itself for countless reasons. Users of the GoodGuide are expressing an urge to heal themselves, to heal one another and other humans, and to, of course, heal the planet. And the systems that succeed are the ones that are going to be the ones that align themselves with those forces and essentially empower them and get out of the way at the same time. So that's it from me, and Dan, maybe you'd like to pick up.
Greg and Dara, thank you very much for that.
Really.
Let me just close with some news I just read. Laptops and computers and electronic devices use brominates. It's a chemical that's a fire retardant. It's really good because it keeps them from catching fire. Then I read that brominates are also carcinogens, and while we're using those devices, they quietly off-gas molecules into the air, which ends up in dust and in us. But this is emblematic of the problem of our entire man-made universe of objects, and we need to rethink it. Dara is giving us a tool that lets anyone shopping become empowered to vote with their dollars for a world with better ecological impacts. Dara lets companies who are sensitive to that, and every company wants to sell us stuff is sensitive to this. And by the way, I think one of the most powerful applications in there are features is that in one click you can email a company. Like I want to, tell my company, I can't name the company, but the one that makes that deodorant I use for years, and say, hey, I love your product, but, and I'll go back to using it if you do this. Turns out if a company gets 3 or 4 such emails, it's handled at a low level. If they get several hundred, it has to be handled at the top executive level. In other words, our voices can be heard now, and heard for good reason rather than on the basis of basically nothing. And then the complement is Erster, where companies who want to do it better can look through the supply chain, see where the points of impact are, and find the suppliers who want to. And this changes a debate going on in every major company today about sustainability. There are voices that say we have to make our operations sustainable. It's the socially responsible thing to do. And then there are other voices that say, yes, but our first duty is to our shareholders. We have a fiduciary responsibility. We can't do it until it pays. This will make it pay to the extent that we can spread the word, use it ourselves, get other people to use it. And I think together we might just save the planet from ourselves. I don't know, it's touch and go. So let's open it for questions. We have a little time left. Thanks. Dara and Greg, why don't you come up too? The mic is here, yeah.
Thank you very much. I had some questions about what you might think of the industrial use of hemp and that sort of thing. It's often brought up as vastly superior to a number of things, and just sort of was dispatched by William Randolph Hearst a number of years ago. And is it possible to get the
LCA for hemp? Anybody?
I'm not a pro on that.
You have an opinion?
Dara, do you have?
No, I mean the basic numbers for the LCA look really good on hemp. It looks like a great crop that we could grow sustainably if you did it the right way. It has basically just for political reasons disappeared from the U.S. market, but other countries now are moving pretty significantly into it. There's ways to do it poorly also. There's an industrialized version of it and a long transport version of it, but I think it is an interesting crop that just for illogical political reasons went away.
Is there, I mean, I imagine importing some of it is possible in some way?
Yeah, if the U.S. would allow it.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Right. Significant legislation changes
Yeah,
are required then.
Right.
Got it.
Just step to the mic.
Well, so getting all that information from, upstream all the way down is pretty hard, especially since it can change in the flexible sort of economy. You almost need, like an RFID chip on every bale of whatever. Do you have any idea how to make this scale? And
That's go ahead.
and how to keep everybody honest in it. I mean, the FDA and those labels, I presume that those are kind of fixed. They don't change, very often.
Right. So 2 great questions. The first is when I had the snowball graphic, I wanted to remember many things, and one of them was the importance of.
No, it's just for camera.
Oh, okay. One of them is the importance of we can make life cycle assessment dynamic by enabling each participant in the supply chain to link their data and to have that data flowing through and basically update on a daily basis. It's not currently dynamic at all. We update these databases once every 2 to 3 years if we're lucky. And so there's a real need because of the dynamism in the economy to make this a live calculation. What that also enables us to do is to track progress. With archiving and dynamics, we now have trends. And we could actually shift or enhance the focus on, as Dan said, we need to go from adjectives to adverbs or to the verb of greening. We can actually say, oh, look at this product, they're reducing, here's the progress they've made. Now that also hinges on your second question, which is validity. Believe it or not, we have peer reviews of life cycle assessment studies. If I'm going to compare 2 bottles as a practitioner, I need to get a peer review of my study before I go public with the results if I want to follow the international standards for life cycle assessment. But nobody's been auditing the reporting by the plants to make sure that if you say this is the kilowatt hours of electricity you used, indeed my purchase records show that was the kilowatt hours. So that's something that we're implementing in Erster. You can publish prior to validation, but your data can't be used in a supply chain calculation until it's been validated. And we're working right now with the Carbon Trust to define the most efficient possible systems for
for on-site validation to try and drive those costs down. But that's going to be a third-party market for validation services. And it can be a combination of capacity building and validation, I think. There's going to be a need for some training as well, even though the software reduces the price.
Just one thing that we've found as we've published this information and got it out in the world is many of the companies that we think of as the manufacturers of these products have no idea actually how to run their supply chain. So Nike is basically a brand and a marketing firm. It doesn't actually manufacture shoes. Apple is no longer a manufacturing company. They're a design and marketing firm. So the first thing that we found is the companies going into their supply chain to figure it out for themselves. They have no idea where these products come from. They have no idea what chemicals are being sourced in China that end up as lead paint on their product that kids are sucking on here in the US. So it's opening up this first to the companies, forces them to do research, then crowdsourcing it lets both academics, nonprofits, other people ground truth the data, and then competitors looking at each other's data. So companies saying Burt's Bees watching 7th Gen, watching Body Shop, making sure that the data is correct. So making this information free immediately creates higher quality data in our experience, including with the firms themselves.
I'm interested in how much the kind of the buy local idea has as an impact to the total supply chain. So I imagine it's hard to value on the GoodGuide, but you know whether something getting from point of production to point of sale or purchase, what percentage of impact that actually has on the total impact?
Yeah, so we actually, we are looking at that as the transportation and distance traveled as a factor in a product. And so if we look, again, we'll go back to my milk, we look and see in the supply chain of that product, how much does transport matter? And you need to know where it was produced and where you live. Right. If you're willing to give me your phone number and your location-based information through latitude, and I know exactly where you are at all moments, then I can give you more accurate data, and we'll say, in this supply chain of milk, how much does transport matter? Now, milk is almost all produced locally in the U.S. It's local dairy, state by state. But for many products, you see that transport is 10% to 15% of the overall impact. There are a few product categories which transport matters a lot, like shipping beer. If you like Chinese beer and you're shipping it all the way from here, or if you're sitting here in California, you want to buy local wine, not French wine. But if you're in Boston, you want French wine, not California wine. It does matter in some product categories where the distance traveled.
Well,
and as
we should talk about Columbus, Ohio.
What's in Columbus, Ohio?
Well, in Columbus, Ohio, you can go either way.
Oh, right, exactly. But so for some, and as we get better data, both on the location of production and where you are, as we enable latitude in our system and in the iPhone, we'll be able to tell you richer information. So there's this movement towards locavores, locally produced food, and in some cases that makes a lot of sense. If you're living in England, locally produced citrus is a bad idea. It just doesn't make sense to try to get local oranges in England. But in other places, it does make sense. So we want to basically go from simple understandings of that to better detail and data.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Yeah, maybe two quick follow-ups on that. First of all, if a greenhouse was involved, chances are it's bad environmentally.
Or an airplane.
Or an airplane, yeah. But I mean, so buying local, if it requires a greenhouse, at least today's greenhouses, and there's a movement toward much more energy efficient greenhouses, but until that happens, you're much better off. And even we did a study of potatoes. A study was done actually as part of a class on potatoes from Massachusetts for Boston consumers versus Idaho. And it turns out because the farming's much more efficient in Idaho, it's worth it to truck them. The other thing, another colleague of mine did a study of locally grown tomatoes in Canada, well, in Quebec. Turns out the seeds were developed and germinated in China. The seed was shipped to Toronto. The seedling was grown there. And finally, the last stage was local. So it looked local, but it's hard to not have a global supply chain, even in a local food product.
This is such a great idea. I'm really glad that this is happening and you have some beta versions, and I really look forward to seeing it come out into the world. I wanted to ask a question about the role of government requirements versus this system that you're envisioning, which is essentially entirely voluntary. I mean, there's no law that says you have to report this stuff, and you're relying on the right incentives to have companies participate. I just wanted to relate the perhaps the informative story of Energy Star, which is this, and that's voluntary in the United States to list energy efficient products, and there's some other product categories that are required by law to be listed, no matter how efficient or inefficient they are. But I guess the point with that is that enforcement is not mandatory for these systems. So I guess what I'm wondering is just, how do you expect enforcement to really work, even though this is a voluntary platform as opposed to a government requirement? And just wondering your
So your
general
question is about
reaction.
enforcing the reporting?
Yes, mostly about that. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, in a way you have, I think, two parts of the answer, with the GoodGuide stimulating the pressure on the companies, and then this really important question of validation, and the crowdsourcing as one aspect of enforcing the verification. One comment I would add, and Jeff, we talked a little bit about this at lunch, I think that taxes harness people's aversion to spending more money than they might be able to avoid spending. But if we can actually flip it around and show people how, through certain choices, they can generate positive benefits, I think the market for doing good is a whole lot bigger than the market for avoiding a little extra tax. And just hasn't been fully tapped, and I think this kind of calculation engine can help us shine the light on that.
So we absolutely are very interested in government taking over some of the heavy lifting of this, and particularly government playing an information forcing role, not saying what the target is or what a product should look like, but just requiring disclosure of key material pieces of information. The last 8 years in the U.S., there's been little potential for advancing radical transparency in Washington, D.C. There is some potential now for transparency. The main action in the U.S. has been at the state level and in Europe. There's been a lot of interesting work. We're working with the California Green Chemistry Initiative. Schwarzenegger, of all people, signed a bill last September to require disclosure of chemical ingredients of all products sold in California. Again, shocking facts. Go home tonight, look at the most toxic chemical you can find in your house. Your toilet bowl cleaner, your oven cleaner, it'll have 0 ingredients listed on it, or maybe 1 ingredient. Your liquid hand soap will have 30 ingredients because it's covered under one law. The most toxic chemicals in your house will have 0 ingredients listed. So we don't even know what's underneath our sink, what's in our house. There's a potential, I think, to bust that open, to force greater transparency. We've decided to go basically the way Google has, just go open on the world for the public for free, and try to then motivate companies to disclose and hopefully then get governments to follow. They've been very slow on these issues. We think the public and retailers are way ahead of the government right now.
And I'd like to speak to that, because there's enormous power in information. You mentioned the Energy Star. All Energy Star did was require that you disclose. It didn't mandate what you have to do. But since Energy Star, and interestingly, when they proposed it, industry said, we can't do that. It's impossible to make a refrigerator that's more efficient. And of course, there are many factors more efficient today than they were when Energy Star went, because the competitive pressure in the marketplace around information disclosure. Do you remember trans fats? In 1993, there's an article, an AP article, that says something called trans fats turns out to cause heart disease. Imagine that. It was only 1993 when there was growing public awareness of trans fats. Within 5-6 years, they started to disappear from products, not because the government said you can't use them, just because we knew. So empowering consumers to know has an enormous effect on companies who want our business. And in fact, some of the biggest retailers in this country are envisioning a day when companies will compete for shelf space in their stores on the basis of their product's ecological footprint. That if it doesn't meet a certain criterion, they're not going to carry that product. So I think the feds can play a very big role, but we can too. And the market has enormous force if we get radical transparency about this.
Thank you. I feel this is wonderful in that a lot of people want to know what they can do in terms of helping with climate change and the issues around that. So looking at the consumer market, is the goal to empower individuals with this kind of information on mobile devices so that when they're in the stores, they can very easily look at products, make the decisions, and actually decide what they pay. And then the second thing, you talked about crowdsourcing. Are you going to make it easy for the feedback loop back to those organizations that are not being ecologically friendly?
Right, absolutely. So yeah, we're trying to get as close as possible to purchasing decisions or company-related decisions. Right now we're focused on shopping. Our data is also useful for choosing an employer or choosing an investment or anything to do with a product or a company. We see the real potential right now is a person in a store or online making a purchasing choice saying, I want to know, is it healthy or not? And if it's not healthy, show me a better one. And then sending a signal in the market both on purchasing an individual, kind of personal individual action, but we're really interested in collective action. We're interested in, can we get enough people sending signals in the market to actually shift the marketplace towards less toxics, less sweatshops, less climate. That's the real long-term vision for this, is providing enough information that we collectively can have some influence over the marketplace. There has been a huge information asymmetry, as Dan points out, in the market where we basically know nothing. We know brand and we know price when we walk into a store. We know nothing about these products we're putting in, on, around ourselves, our families. So we're trying to first even the playing field on information and then hopefully empower collective action, and then create a real feedback loop to companies, both the ones that are out front doing good things and the laggards.
Right, so as part of the apps, if I look at two products and I make a decision on one versus the other, to be able to give feedback to the one I didn't choose, why I didn't choose it, at that time when I'm purchasing would be a really great thing.
That's a great idea. Thanks.
Thanks. We have two more quick questions. I think we need to wrap up.
So, as far as the Energy Star and the nutrition labels, you brought up trans fats. Well, that's something where I'm really quite disappointed, because there's all sorts of stuff labeled as 0 gram trans fats, which is not exactly true, because they can say that, all they have to do is get under 1 or half or something.
Yeah, under 0.6, and you can call it 0. So this is the current system of food labeling in the U.S. As we've done research on each product category, there's either complete absence of data, there's no information, like the household chemicals, there's just no information, or industry has very effectively lobbied for the ability to make claims on the product packages or to dilute the required mandatory disclosure. So food, if you go into a store, it's a catastrophe. This week, Cheerios, I don't know if you saw, there was actually a letter from the FDA saying Cheerios can no longer claim that it's a medical device lowering your cholesterol levels, because the claims were getting so ridiculous on their package about what eating Cheerios would do for you. We basically industry has set the rules of disclosure on their products. So there's all sorts of loopholes, the ability to basically mask what's really in the product. And ours is a small attempt to try to surface better information in a more understandable form. We're very far away from really nailing that, but that's our goal, is that kind of transparency.
And with that, let's say thanks to Dan, Greg, and Dara. Thank you.